Okay, we'll start. My name's Christine Phillips. I'm from the Australian National University Medical School. It's a pleasure to welcome you all here today for this really important and very, very topical seminar. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous leaders of the land upon which we stand today and their leaders past and present. And for those of you who are watching this on a webinar, the leaders of the lands upon which you stand and their leaders past and present. Thanks very much. Distinguished guests, is it Your Excellency Mr. Vasyl Myroshnychenko, Dr. Tanya, Mr. Stefan Romaniw, and Mr. Bruce Edwards, who is the Australian Ambassador to Ukraine, is with us tonight. Students, colleagues, and other people in the community who have come in here who are interested in this, welcome all. This evening's session is going to be run not by me, but by a wonderful medical student from third year, Miss Dia Paliwell. Dia has had a strong interest in this area for a very long time, and as a former president of the Australian Medical Students International Global and Public Health Division. I'm going to hand over now to Dia, who's going to take this from now. Thank you, Dia.
Hello everyone, and thank you Christine for extending such a warm welcome to our audience tonight and highlighting that we're all here for a very important issue. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our guest speakers down here, who I'm assured will bring to the audience insightful talks and a rich panel discussion on this important issue. Starting with His Excellency Vasyl Myroshnychenko, the extraordinary and the plenipotentiary Ambassador of Ukraine to Australia and New Zealand. The Ambassador is also a member of the Supervisory Board of the Ukrainian Institute, a cultural diplomacy outfit of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine prior to joining the Foreign Service. The Ambassador was an active business and civil society leader in Ukraine, including as a co-founder of the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center in 2014, which is an NGO aimed at promoting the voice of Ukrainians internationally. Given the severity of the crisis currently facing your proud nation, Your Excellency, we could not have been more privileged to have your presence here today, so thank you. Our second panelist is Dr. Tanya, who is an Australian-born psychiatrist with family and cultural ties in Ukraine. In her clinical role at the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital in Sydney, she has been supporting Ukrainian and Russian patients facing language barriers in accessing quality healthcare, along with providing cultural training to her fellow colleagues. In the light of Ukraine's current crisis, she has been working with her clinical colleagues to create a clinical support network for newly arrived refugees, including the Women's Circle, a support group for Ukrainian refugee women. We are delighted to have your presence here today, Tanya. And finally, we are privileged to have Mr. Stefan Romaniw, OAM, who is a prominent Ukrainian community leader and activist in Australia. Originally a school teacher and principal in Melbourne, he is now the Executive Director of Community Languages Australia and the Vice President of the Ukrainian World Congress. He has received the Order of Australia Medal amongst several other recognitions for his service towards education and language learning for people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. He frequently consults with the Australian government and media on issues concerning multiculturalism and the Ukrainian community. We are very grateful for your presence here today as well, Stefan. I would now like to invite His Excellency Vasyl Myroshnychenko to enlighten us with his unique insights about the current crisis in Ukraine.
Dia, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. My friends, Your Excellency Bruce Edwards, my counterpart from Ukraine now, and he's been 3 years there, right? Almost 2, right? But that was also, and I've been here 6 months, and we've been just discussing that I've become a bit Aussie and he's become a bit Ukrainian by this time, and it's always interesting to sort of exchange notes and see what is out there that we kind of focus on. But it's a fascinating country you have, and I'm so delighted to be in Australia. This past 6 months has been a whirlwind for me. But what I really like is actually that everywhere I go, or whoever I meet, I ask some questions about Australia, about Australian history, culture, and this is how I've actually been learning, because I bought many books on Australia now on my bookshelves, but I don't have time to read. But it's always good to, go out there and ask questions. And so apart from talking, I really like asking questions, and this is probably, once I'm done with my job for the government, I will become a journalist or something, and we'll be asking questions. But anyways, look, medical school, and I understand many of you here are medical students, and I was just sharing before we here that I was actually meant to become a doctor. My father is a neurologist, and my mother is a general practitioner. So when I was a kid, I spent lots of time in a hospital, in a rural hospital in southwestern part of Ukraine, and I didn't know anything else, right? It was all medical books in the house. It was all about smell of the hospital. So you kind of, you kind of live there, and you don't know anything else, right? So until the age of 13 or 14, I was, dreaming about a career of a neurologist, and my father said, look, you become a neurologist, I'm going to share with you all my knowledge, and I don't know why, but my father said, look, I've got this photocopied books on neurology from the United States of America, because I copied them in some sort of library in Kiev. And in those days, to get a photocopy of that book, it was literally on film, like film. Remember when we were printing pictures? That was actually, each page was like pictured, and that was like a very, secret knowledge. And he said, well, once day you'll learn English, you'll be able to read that book. I'm like, wow, what a motivation. I don't know if that was what actually propelled me to study English, but I have to tell you the story. So every family in Ukraine, if you live in more or less outside of a big city, you have a plot of land, right? And in the 90s, it was one of the ways to survive, so you had to grow your own potatoes, vegetables, and all of that, right? So I remember in the early 90s, all of a sudden, my parents, who kind of, got this plots of land, and they said, now we have to grow our own potatoes, cabbage, and all of that. And as a kid, I just hated that, I said, oh my goodness. So they would make you work every weekend there, right? So the only excuse for me not to be working on that plot of land when I had English classes. And they said, oh, I can't do it. I've got my English class. Sorry, I'm missing it. So that really helped, apart from other things. But anyways, look, I came here to talk about some serious matters, and of course, the topic that we have in here is very sad, but I still want to sort of share my optimism, because I think that without that optimism, it will be very difficult for Ukrainians to survive. And it's especially if you look at Ukraine's healthcare right now, it's really, it's just unbelievable what's happening. So just to give you some of the idea, right? So we have over 5 million people who fled the country, right? Then we have another 9 million who are internally displaced, right? Russian troops are targeting hospitals. About 900 hospitals were ruined. Some were ruined completely, right? Many schools have been destroyed, right? And you can imagine how many wounded people we have, right? Nobody knows the casualties in Ukraine, but they're pretty high. And for every death, you get at least 3 wounded, right? So pretty much many hospitals now operate as military hospitals. Ukrainian surgeons have had to become the best wartime surgeons, because at the end of the day, as a surgeon, how often would you operate on somebody who got, a shrapnel, right? But now all of a sudden, for the past 8 years, all those doctors learned how to deal with shrapnel, how to deal with some serious bullet wounds, and they just had to learn it on the job. So apparently now, we have the best surgeons in the world who know how to operate on people with bullet wounds and with shrapnel and other explosives that people get affected to. And in a way, I mean, it's really scary because you can imagine how much stress these people have to go through. As you know, in those cities which were under siege, and one of those was Mariupol, actually, in the early days of the war. I mean, I saw a footage from Reuters. I mean, that was just unbelievable. And there was actually footage from hospital. So there were a lot of people who got wounded. Many civilians got killed in you know, the whole Mariupol was a city of 500,000 people. It's gone. There is no more Mariupol, right? It's like Aleppo in Syria. It's gone, right? Razed completely. So a lot of civilians were trapped in the city, being continuously shelled by the Russians. So whatever hospitals they had there, they tried to provide treatment, right? So a lot of wounded people were brought into the hospital. And then there was this Reuters journalist, I don't know how in the world he got into that hospital, but he made this video from that hospital. You just Google it, you'll find it. I think it's from around April or end of March. You know, and the city was under siege, no water, no electricity. It was still winter, it was still very cold. And they had a morgue just in the basement. So basically, a lot of people were wounded, but they didn't have anything to treat with. So people that would just die actually there because they couldn't do anything. They couldn't provide the assistance. So it's really mind-boggling to realize what kind of things our doctors have to go through. How much, even, you know, and I think generally a profession of a doctor is a very traumatizing job because, you know, and doctors often become very cynical, right? Because it just, once you see death all the time, right? You deal with death all the time, but now you multiply it by 20 or 30 because the level of death you see in Ukraine now is just, you know, staggering. I mean, for just regular people, because now, you know, all the war is on this phone, right? And you can see it live from here. And it's kind of difficult to forget, and this is what gets into your brain forever. And that's going to be a major and other issue which we'll have to deal with. And Tanya will talk more about it as a psychiatrist. But, you know, the whole society is traumatized. Everybody, every single Ukrainian, including Ukrainian people, Ukrainian communities abroad, because I think if you even live abroad, as a Ukrainian who has very relatives in Ukraine, you get even traumatized more. And I've seen it by talking to Ukrainian community, especially to people who came during the past 20, 30 years, who still have relatives in Ukraine, who have very close connection to Ukraine. And the stress they have to go through is unbelievable, you know, and they're here in Australia in a safe place, but they actually live with Ukraine. They wake up with Ukraine, they go to bed with Ukraine, and it's all, you know, now online, right? And they get and it just, if you actually look, you know, Ukrainians are still suffering from the World War II. And it's actually, we can even go earlier, because if you look at the past century, and if you're interested in the history of Ukraine, I would recommend reading a book by Timothy Snyder. He's a Yale professor. He's written a book called Bloodlands of Europe, where you can read the history of the 20th century. And when you actually look at what Ukrainians had to go through, and how many Ukrainians have died in the 20th century, you really realize why it's called the Bloodlands of Europe. Because when the Russian Empire collapsed, Ukraine became independent for 3 years. 3.5, 4 years, we had several different governments there in place. But then the Bolsheviks came, they crushed the independence, killed many Ukrainians, declared the Ukrainian Socialist Republic, and declared Soviet Union in December 1922. And then in the early 30s, as Stalin started collectivization, actually forcing people to go into collective farms, Ukrainians didn't want to join collective farms. So what did he do? He just starved those people. Around 6 million people, maybe more, have died in an artificial famine in 1932, 1933. In 1937, Stalin saw that Ukrainians were resisting to the Soviet Union. So to sort of deal with that resistance, he just terrorized people and executed the whole elites in Ukraine, including in the military, but also in cultural scenes, and writers, poets, composers. Everybody got executed or sent to Siberia if you were lucky, right? And then the war started. And then during the Second World War, Soviet Union incurred 22 million casualties. Out of 22 million casualties, 12 million were Ukrainian, 7 were from Belarus, and then followed by the Russians, right? So it's huge. And then all this Ukrainian, and actually now, you know, having grown up and kind of still being born in the Soviet Union, and then growing up, you still live as a trauma of the Second World War. And then Russians invaded us in 2014, grabbed Crimea, killed 14,000 Ukrainians, and we've had this war for 8 years already, right? And then, you know, another attack which just came in 2014 at a different scale with different kind of weapons, and now it just you know, got out of proportion in terms of the impact it's going to have. So, speaking of trauma, I think, you know, we'll need a great deal of assistance from all of our friends and allies in sort of therapy, right? In helping people to cope with that. Many families are separated. People have, you know, psychological breakdowns. Refugees who are out there are women with kids. They don't know the local language. They have to take care of kids. They have their husbands, they are there in the trenches, you know, fighting. And this is just unbelievable what's kind of impact it's having. And we are not yet even talking about it because we just can't. We have some other priorities. We just have to survive, which is a different kind of priority before we think about our mental health. But as you know, World Health Organization has defined mental health as one of the most serious issues that most of the people in the world are dealing with, along with obesity, diabetes, and you know, cardiovascular diseases and all that. But mental health is a big part of it, right? And now, you know, being actually amplified by this war, it takes it to a different level. But look, what I want to talk about is actually about how we can help Ukraine. And Australian people have been really out there from the very beginning of this war, extremely supportive. And that, you know, translated to the support of the Australian government. And we have bipartisan support here. Military assistance is really highly appreciated in Ukraine. And Bruce cannot let me mislead you here. He's probably never seen so much reporting about Australia as during the past 7 months, because Australia is in the news quite often. And I mean, people in Ukraine have never heard about so much about Australia. And this is good. This is great. And one friend of mine, there was actually a kind of an anecdote. So when Prime Minister Albanese came to Ukraine, that was, you know, this first time in history that a Prime Minister of Australia went to Ukraine, right? Imagine we already have relations for 30 years. We've never had, you know, anybody from Australia, you know, of the level of the Prime Minister. And then my friend sends me a message saying, hey, seeing a Prime Minister from Australia in Kyiv is like seeing aliens land here, you know? Like, wow. You know, that's kind of a level you get, you know? It's just like, wow. You know, all the Europeans, of course, Americans have been there many times, right? But like seeing Australian, yeah, do you agree? Yeah, I mean, it's been out there, but, you know, in a good sense. And so everybody's, of course, talking about Bushmaster. Bushmaster became a symbol of military assistance. It's really massive. It's just, you know, Ukraine has become very big experts on all military kit, and everybody knows Javelin, everybody knows NASAMS or HIMARS, and out there in those brand names, Bushmaster is standing very strong, because I think this is like really, it's a good brand name. So I was surprised to learn that it's a venomous snake, actually, when I was in Bendigo, because I thought Bushmaster is somebody, a master in a bush, you know, with a sword or something. And then it turns out it's just a snake. But anyways, it's good we got those venomous snake, you know, chasing Russians out of Ukraine. And they really do a good job. But look, we have a good panel. We'll talk about, well, of course, the topic is about refugees. So there are many different issues that refugees have to deal with, apart from, of course, getting health advice. You know, it's everything, right? Because imagine that Australia gets invaded, right? And all people of Sydney and Melbourne, all of them, have to move out to Adelaide and Perth, right? In a period of 2 weeks. So we have 9 million internally displaced people. This is pretty much the size of your 2 biggest cities. So you imagine they all have to move and build tent cities in the desert out there near Adelaide or something. I don't know. Because 9 million people is a lot. Accommodation, public health, education. I mean, how is it possible? How can you do that in such a short period of time? But this is what we have to deal with. Being one of the poorest countries in Europe, for us, I mean, it's a disaster. We have 40 million people in Ukraine, and now having this huge displacement. The economy is pretty much paralyzed. We only recently have been able to unblock our Black Sea ports, which is still kind of a trickle of what we can get out to the global markets. Russians have caused a major food crisis in the world. People in the Horn of Africa and Middle East are starving because they can't get a hold of the Ukrainian food. Ukraine is one of the biggest producers of grain, corn, sunflower oil, animal feed. The whole Middle East and Africa depends on our food, including Indonesia, by the way. And all of a sudden, they can't get it. The price of baby food has gone up because the major ingredient for baby food is sunflower oil, of which we are the largest producers in the world. The prices for energy have gone up. They surged because there is so much uncertainty, and it's just intensifying, right? It's really crazy what's going on. And everybody's feeling the impact of this war everywhere, including here in Australia. Therefore, it's so important to be out there supporting Ukraine in any possible way, because nobody can afford for Ukraine to fall. I'm talking about democracies, because we are out there on the front lines defending democracy, freedom, human rights, all the values which every Australian values and is a big part of their life. And you'll be surprised by how much we are much more look alike, It's only 2 hours, 45 minutes from Kyiv to Paris. It's 3.5 hours to London to fly. Last time I went to Perth, it was 4 hours from here. So you imagine, Kyiv is in the heart of Europe. It's really out there. It's very close. So having this war out there is just unbelievable. But that's a fight that Putin has started. It's his fight against democracy. It's his fight against, human rights values. It's just unbelievable what's happening. And there is no rational explanation why he's done it. In his mind, it was pretty rational what he did, but that's unfortunate. And we have any Russian here in the room, I think Putin has deprived those people of his people and his grandchildren, his children and grandchildren. He's deprived them of a future in Russia, because Russians become toxic. Everything Russian is tainted. And it's for at least 2 generations to come. This war will end one day, but this reputation damage won't be fixed very quickly, because it's all memorized, it's all out there, it's all on video, it's perpetuated. And we'll never be able to forgive or forget, which of course as a psychologist, as a psychiatrist, is going to tell me we have to forgive, right? To live with that. But for us, it's very difficult. It's almost impossible, because you go on YouTube, and how can you forgive that? Once you learn about war crimes in Izum, in Bucha, all the civilians who got raped, tortured, murdered, how can you forgive that? What's the rationale or military rationale behind that, apart from terrorizing the people of Ukraine? Look, I think I've talked enough, and my time is up, and we're going to have a very nice panel discussion. So I think I'm just going to finish here, and of course, you're more than welcome to come with any of the questions you may have. But it's great to be back at ANU. That's one of my favorite universities where I speak. I've spoken here 5 or 6 times by now, and I'm doing another gig next week, so you're more than welcome to come if you can. I'll talk about bigotry and racism there, but look, anyways, so thanks a lot for having me, and yes, who's the boss? Dia, you're the boss.
Thank you, Ambassador. There is no doubt that Ukraine's invasion is definitely one of the most severe refugee crises in living memory. And thank you for highlighting all the multifaceted aspects of this crisis. It's very inspiring to see your optimism, and you see you share your optimism with the audience here tonight and also with the Ukrainians facing this. All right, now can we please welcome Dr. Tanya to the stage to... Oh, okay, all right. All right. Can we please welcome Mr. Stefan Romaniw to share his unique insights on this?
Before I start, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we meet on and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We're quite privileged today to have two ambassadors, and to His Excellency Vasyl Myroshnychenko and also to His Excellency Bruce Edwards, to have two ambassadors in the same room at the same time, representing the reciprocal countries. I think is something very, very special which we should cherish, because ultimately you can get both perspectives today. Could I also thank you to Paul and to Christine and everybody here for your hospitality and your warmth. And Tanya, I've been with your husband now nearly 2 days now, take him back with you. My role today is maybe just to speak a little bit about what we do as a community. And who are we? We're the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organisation. We're the peak body here in Australia. We're also members of the Ukrainian World Congress. I'm Vice President of the World Congress. We have about 65 countries, 20 million outside, a lot more now after the war. And obviously every country where there are Ukrainians today, Ukrainian communities, we're dealing with these issues because people are fighting, people are now resettling, and they want to be part of something. I just want to run you through a few steps. What happened? How did all this come about in terms of Australia? First couple of days we had a call from Prime Minister Morrison, who basically said, what are we going to do? And the discussion with Anthony Albanese, then the leader of the opposition, was bipartisan. We have to do something. And it was to get people to a safe place. So what's the easiest visa regime to get people into a safe place? So we continue to have meetings with government and consult. The challenges. So, you know, you have a community like ours. It sings, it dances, it tries to keep schools going, identity, integration as opposed to assimilation, and all of a sudden you're confronted with this situation. The unknown, and this is where I think Tanya will speak about, the unknown is the biggest thing. Family reunion, will we be able to be a family again? Somebody's fighting, somebody's here, there are visa regimes, there are a whole range of issues. Mental health, which I'll come back to and Tanya's going to speak to. Accommodation, and as Ambassador said, I'm not sure I want to live in Adelaide, but I might go to Perth or somewhere, or Port Douglas or something like that, if I had a choice. Employment. You know, we have, I said to Tanya before, we have a psychiatrist in Melbourne, for example. She was a psychiatrist in Ukraine. I brought her papers back when I was there recently. You know, we've got things about overseas qualifications. How's all that going to work? And I think you understand that, and as the Ambassador said, to speak to this auditorium is terrific, because you're the future. You need to know these things. These are the things where you might be able to help us. Employment, education. You know, we've done a whole survey of people who are educated people in Ukraine. They want to be able to somehow get their qualifications recognised here. These are also the everyday issues that we were never confronted with before. Medical payments. You know, you wanted to go from one visa's category to the other, cost you $150, $200 to go across. You got 3 kids, it's money. And it's those everyday things that we have to deal with. And the new visa arrangements. We obviously lobby government for support, and as the Ambassador said, you know, military sanctions. We've written to the Prime Minister again today, expel the Russian ambassador. Why? Because he's lied to us. He's lied to the Australian public. He told us there was going to be no war. Not only did he tell us, he mocked us and said, what do you think? Don't you people understand? And now he says we're brainwashed. But we also have good relationships with agencies, and those agencies are very, very important. The community kicks in. First thing we did was create the War Cabinet. So we, as a body nationally, we have state representations, we have 22 peak bodies that belong to us. We all kicked in. How do we deal with the influx, and how do you capitalise on that situation? So the community kicks in, and immediately as people arrive, you have to make them feel part of something. You have to give them the sense of identity, and you have to somehow allay those fears that they have. This is only part of it, and I want to call out give a call out to the community here in Canberra and ACT. Every single day for the last 7 months, they've been outside the Russian embassy demonstrating. They've also been having fundraisers. They've done a fantastic job for a small community. They've done a fantastic job. But these are the sort of things around the country. You know, we've had English language classes, job opportunities, Victoria Police. You know, the concept of police and somebody in a uniform, and they came to the schools, and the children from Ukraine were able to sit in the car, in a police car, put on a siren, do all those things our kids like to do. Excursions. The whole issue of places like Tassie. I've been to Tassie a couple of times. They do a fantastic job. Food distribution, clothes distribution. People have come with they come with a handbag. That's what they came with. They had nothing. Mobile phone rollout. Unfortunately, it was Optus. The current situation. Ambassador's spoken to, we were in Ukraine with Anthony Albanese, and one thing that resonates with me, what the Prime Minister said when we had a bit of time with him. He went to see Irpin, he went to see those places that had been shot up, and his comment was, I don't understand how one human can do this to another human. And I think that really says something about this war. We have open dialogue and so on. Government funding, we got some government funding because we're all volunteers, and ultimately been able to set up some associations to take lead on some of this thing. The majority have settled in New South Wales and Victoria, but they're scattered around Australia. We have about 5,000 here at the moment. We set up a comms team, very, very important to communicate. Communicate to who? Communicate to those people who have arrived, those people who are hosting them. And again, Australia, we constantly say this, I've been to Ukraine a couple of times, but people are so grateful to Australia. I'm so proud to be an Australian. When you think that within a couple of weeks, we had 2,700 Australians put up their hand and say, I have a bedroom, I have a house, 7,870 spots. Amazing. That's Australia. That's the Australia that we live in because we care. We have a value system that we're fighting for. We have a Ukraine crisis appeal, and there's a lot of money that goes into that, and we've 6.7 million has been donated. We're building shelters. We're doing a range of issues. We've also helped with drones. We've worked with government. We've worked with Rotary. We've worked with Caritas to settle people in Ukraine. Because we're also, as Ambassador said, those people who were in the east, they came to the west because they thought it was safe. There's no place safe in Ukraine at the moment. Those people, a lot of those people, and I know those who have travelled to Ukraine, we would have seen the first couple of weeks, the buses that were going out onto the Polish border and other borders. They're now coming back. Those people have to go somewhere. Where do they go? What we've done is we've done responding to needs. We did a survey where we're constantly asking people. You don't want to second guess on these things, but these are education, settlement, higher education, business opportunities, the whole issue of accommodation, of food, of employment are issues that are very, very important. And keeping ahead of the feelings. What we tried to do immediately was to get ahead of the feeling. I'm depressed. Yes, we can't manage that. But what we can do is at least retain it and box it in. So, whether it's a visit to Puffing Billy in thing, whether it's going somewhere in Sydney or in Adelaide and camps and those sorts of things, to the the Melbourne Royal Show, Sydney Fest, Yuki Fest. Again, thousands of people, but what we said to the community was, you know what, don't organise it. Make sure those people are part of that organisation, because mentally, that's going to impact. Look what we've created. We've got a war, we've got all those things. But look what we've done. We have reinvigorated the Ukrainian community here. Life skills. You know, what we do is we run different, and we use different agencies. How do you get a job? How do you do a CV? What do you have to do to be employed? How do you drive a car? People say, well, what do you want to worry about that for? Independence. Swimming lessons. You know what, in Australia, the highest level of people who die from drowning are people from non-English speaking backgrounds. Why? Because a lot of people don't, everybody wants to jump in the ocean, everybody wants to have a good time. Nobody understands what a rip is. So those sort of things are happening. Children and normality. You know, we've got 38% of the people that have arrived are children, under the age of 18. And you see these children and you say to yourself, well, hang on, you know, how do we make it as normal as we can for them? Because from these activities, they have to go home. They're there with their mother, most cases, doing English lessons. And some of them, I've got to say, like the ambassador said he learned English. A lot of them speak English very, very well, without an accent. You know, they speak like the Aussies, you know. Just want to quickly, 2 minutes. Strengths. We've got government support, we've got national coordination, we have activities to engage with the community, and we try to give hope. The opportunities are strengthening our communities throughout Australia have been strengthened by this. And it's sad that you have got to get that to get that, but we have to capitalise on that. And there are new opportunities for DPs. The threats are, there is the issue of mental health, and Tanya will speak about that. That is one of the things that ultimately, unsure, you know yourself, if you're not sure about whether you're going to pass your exam, or you're not sure whether you've studied hard enough, or you're not sure, you know, you don't sleep at night. Imagine not being sure whether you're going to see your husband or your father or your brother again. The Russian disinformation, obviously is a threat, and we try to do that. The weaknesses is a lack of information at times, you know, government getting messages out and so on. More structured support. And the visa regime at the moment, for us, is we're negotiating. I want to finish off with this. I spoke to our governor, Linda Dessau, earlier on in the piece, and Linda's very much into mental health, women's issues and so on. And I've known Linda for a long time. I said, look, we have this issue, what do you think we can do? So Linda came up with this idea and basically said, you know what, let's bring in 25 people, 25 women, into Government House every week, over a number of weeks. So basically, they come to Government House, they walk, they talk, and that's important. Just, they don't all know each other. They go into a garden, they pick some vegetables, they cook, and they have a meal. They're sunflowers, okay? And the reason I want to finish with this is, those sunflowers were planted early on in the piece. They all got, and they're going to come back in December to a dinner hosted by the governor. By that stage, these sunflowers would have grown. And the message is, you know, we can grow. We have to be able to, there is hope. There is hope at the end of the tunnel. And collectively, we can work together. In your space, I know a lot of the questions we get is, how can I help? You know what, we have www.ukrainecrisisappeal.org or OZEUKES.com. If you can help in any way, and it's not just financial. I mean, a lot of the people here are medical students. You know, we have people who, you know, you might be able to work with us, you might be able to work with people like Tanya and that, but ultimately, we're in this together. Ukraine will win, and we have to give people hope, and that's what we try to do as far as the community is concerned. So, thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. So my key takeaway from that talk was hope, growth and action. And also go Australia for supporting the fellow Ukrainians and everything that the community is doing. It's really inspiring. And the SWOT analysis was really good. I think I'd like to expand on that during the panel discussion. Now, now can I please invite Dr. Tanya to the stage to share her unique insights.
My background is, I call myself a Ukrainian Australian. My father came here after the war, as did my mother as a much younger person, and had the classic post-war migrant experience. I was born here, but I grew up not speaking English literally till I went to school, and apparently I learnt English within 2 weeks of starting kindergarten. I've been a proud member of the Ukrainian community in Sydney, and that's meant immersion in Saturday Ukrainian school, dancing, singing, scouts. We even had a little women's ensemble with an accordion, my friend Nina, and we called ourselves the Willow, which was verba in Ukrainian. So, you know, I've grown up in a very rich community, and I feel doubly proud to be Australian for Australia's response in supporting Ukraine, and part of the Ukrainian communities that have really risen to help the new arrivals. So, talking about refugees, you know, refugees are an incredibly admirable group. I mean, they are resourceful, they have verve, a lot of literature exists to show that they are extremely robust, and it's perhaps the self-selecting population who is prepared to cross seas, you know, to go to distant places in order to escape, you know, unbearable situations. The world has shown a lot of admiration for not just Ukrainian fighters, but populations, you know, women standing in front of tractors, tanks, and, you know, just the world has sort of stood up and taken notice and said, gee, we didn't know about Ukraine, we didn't know about the people. But those of us who've grown up with Ukrainian parents aren't surprised by that resilience, because we've always seen them as very strong people. And I think this particular population of people who've arrived in Australia since probably March, as Stefan said, you know, the majority are women with children. It takes enormous courage. I mean, whatever trauma that you've left behind, you're usually leaving partners, parents. Ukrainian families are very integrated. There's no such thing as aged care. People look after their elderly relatives. So these people have hopped on crowded trains during COVID, gone across the country, waited for days across borders, sat in some intermediary country, filled out forms, often with very poor English, and gotten here. That in itself is pretty amazing. So it's not surprising that they are a group that we really admire. And I understand there have been over 4,000, as Stefan pointed out, most of them to the big cities, but also there's a lot have gone to regional centres in places in New South Wales like Orange, Corindi, Tamworth and Gunnedah. So this resilience allows them then to navigate all of the challenges that exist in the new country, and these aren't unique to Ukrainian arrivals, but acculturation is a huge issue. While you're trying to understand the new culture and new systems, learn a language, try to support your children, establish them into school, try to find work yourself, usually at a much lower level of functioning than you had in your home country. You're also still having one foot in the old country. A lot of these women that we see here they still have their air raid alerts on their phones. They want to know what's happening with their families. They're often awake, you know, Ukraine being 8 or 9 hours behind. They can't really divest themselves of the responsibility and the concern. Particularly, you know, their husbands may be at the front, their parents may be displaced, and of course they have the loyalty to their country. So we're seeing a lot of survivor guilt. I think that's an understatement. You know, I recently had a conversation with a parish priest in Sydney. This is a really strong emotion that is hard to counter. It's sure, you arrive at a new country and you feel safe, there's no air raid sirens here, and you know, your needs are being met in a physical sense. But it's really hard to let go of the feeling that you have left your country, you've left your family, and you're no longer involved in the fight against an awful oppressor. And I think that's something that we can really help, not just psychiatrists, but pretty much any health professionals who see refugees, is allowing them to feel safe here without feeling guilt. And they need to be told that, you know, it's clearly not enough just to tell them, but this is a really strong feeling that we see. And when you get people, like we've had a women's circle established, when you get people drop their barriers and start talking about it, that is one of the really prominent emotions that they have to deal with. Then you've got the particular stresses of coming straight from a country at war. Like, apart from recent Afghani refugees, there have been no other groups that literally within days of leaving a war-torn country arrive at a point of safety, you know, in a place where it could take 25 hours to fly. It's just unheard of. Most of our refugees that have come to Australia have gone through various filtration processes, really, you know, treacherous means, but they've often spent years, and then when they get here, they've often been in camps. So it takes a while till they reach their target, you know, situation. Whereas we've got people literally, you know, weeks after thinking of coming to Australia, turning up here. And of course, they can't escape the images of the war. As the ambassador said, it's on your phone. There's been no other war where the immediacy of the images, of the sentiments, literally you can see images from the front, you know, hours after they happen. And that's very challenging. The word triggering, I mean, it's triggering for us who don't come from there. The whole world is viscerally really affected by it. But if that is your homeland, that is really hard to deal with. And it's hard to turn off. Again, that survivor guilt, when you talk to some of the people who arrived here, they feel guilty if they're not in tune. I feel guilty when I'm not following the news. I was born here, but you can imagine if that's your homeland, it is really hard to turn off. So the immediacy is a factor. We also know that the nature of the stress makes a difference. And I mean, the term PTSD is so well known, I don't even need to say the words behind it. And everyone knows about post-traumatic stress disorder. There's a lot of research been done on PTSD in Australia. In fact, Australian psychiatrists Sandy McFarlane and Beverly Raphael were really at the forefront of understanding PTSD from the plethora of Australian natural disasters that we've had, but particularly from those massive bushfires we had decades ago in South Australia and Victoria. And so a lot of the key research on PTSD was done then. And the initial feeling was that you should really get in there and try and unpack the trauma fairly quickly. The people needed to be debriefed, they needed to face the trauma, relive it, you know, talk about it. We've really swung the pendulum the other way. I think now there's much more of a feeling that when it's very raw, when it's very recent, people need time. They need to sort of bunker down and feel safe. And often it's a matter of packing it away till a point where you can deal with it later. This is not just war-related trauma. This is childhood, you know, sexual abuse trauma, any type of aggressive trauma. You know, people deal with it in their own time. And in this country, we have tremendous resources. If you want to get psychological support in Australia, there's so many ways that you can get that. In Ukraine, it's fair to say that psychology is a fairly recent innovation. Psychology as we know it, where you go and you meet someone and you talk with them regularly. Psychiatry has been highly suspect from the Soviet era when it was used quite liberally as a means of oppression and monitoring. And so the older generation aren't trusting of psychiatry. They're not prone to sit down and offload their stressors with a stranger. Certainly this younger generation is much more likely to try it. And we know that certainly in the big cities in Ukraine pre-war, certainly when I say pre-war, post the 2014 war start, you know, when Russians took Crimea, there has been a lot of psychology developed and people have started seeing counsellors. It's mixed with a lot of cultural preferences. Ukrainians really are closely attuned to nature and they often use nature therapy in various forms and sort of combining it with psychology. We found from our women's group that I'll come back to later, this sort of hybrid approach really works for Ukrainian refugees. So these early interventions are not necessary. I mean, it's, as the ambassador said, right now this country is just about survival. It's really hard to provide counselling in Ukraine. We can offer it here, but gee, there's going to be a massive need. So the nature of the trauma, when it's so personal, you know, when there is torture, when there's rape, when there's, you know, people witness death, when there's maiming, as we see there's so many injuries that will have to be dealt with for years, displacement, children being sent, into Russia and possibly never to be seen again. These sort of things are not easily dealt with, and there's a minefield to be encountered in the rebuilding of Ukraine, which I also am confident will happen. So the symptoms of PTSD, we often talk about CPTSD or complex PTSD, and this is a result of prolonged or particularly intense trauma. And there's often emotional dysregulation as part of that. The various parts of PTSD, as well as we see people avoiding, just feeling numb, not being able to talk about it, just shutting it down completely. We see reliving symptoms, whether that's flashbacks while alert, nightmares that are intrusive, and then all sorts of, avoidance. The various parts of PTSD often then become much bigger clinical issues when people develop quite prominent anxiety, depression. Psychosis is rare, but dissociation of a means of coping, this sort of disconnectedness emotionally. These things are common we see this as a response to extreme stress. I think a pattern of response that is not unique to Ukrainian migrants, but somatization is very common, where people will come and express bodily symptoms. Their head hurts, their back is aching. I'm not saying they don't have physical symptoms, but they often do find it hard to connect with psychological distress. And they're very proud, and they often find it hard to come and say, I feel depressed, or I'm worried I'm depressed, I can't focus, on my children. So you often have to give them time to develop a relationship, and sometimes you do need to pick that apart when you're seeing them. But back to our Ukrainian refugees. So apart from all of the wonderful interventions that Stefan was saying the Ukrainian community has helped with, finding accommodation, linking people in with social services, helping to understand the medical system here is really important. And a colleague of mine, Stephen Dormer, and I in Sydney, just provided the service through an email address on the Ukrainian Facebook site where people could contact us to try and be put in touch with Ukrainian-speaking health professionals who had all volunteered. We spoke with them. This is pre-Medicare, so a whole army of people were willing to offer their services, because speaking in your own tongue and seeing someone who's culturally sensitive does make it easier to accept the treatment, but it's not always possible to see someone who speaks in your own language. So just helping them understand the system is really important. It can seem so daunting. People come with pre-existing problems, for instance, children with developmental issues. If your child has autism, and part of that is difficulty communicating. You may or may not have had help with that in Ukraine. But where do you go here? You just don't know where to start. So we've tried to assist people, and seeing them get the support that they need through interpreters, albeit as rarely is that level of care available in the same language, has been really gratifying. At RPA, where I work in Sydney, we asked for some consideration if Ukrainian or Russian speakers displaced from Ukraine needed hospitalisation, could they be transferred to our hospital where there was a Russian-speaking and Ukrainian-speaking psychiatrists, and that was provided. These sort of simple interventions mean a lot. The transgenerational trauma, that the ambassador referred to, you really can't underestimate how much that is still operating in Ukraine. And I know this from my own father. It's hard to believe that what happened to his father, he was a mayor of a town, the Russians came and said, you must renounce Ukraine. He said, no, he's packed off to Siberia, sent back after decades of torture and trauma, pretty much to die as an example. So the amount of hatred that there is then transferred, from one generation to another, to the point where my children know stories about this from my late father. And it is really hard to unpack when you know what Ukraine has endured. It is the bloodlands of Europe, and I can highly recommend that book the ambassador mentioned by Timothy Snyder. It does seem to have got it in the neck from various directions over centuries. And there are still survivors in Australia from the Holodomor, which is the term we use for the artificial famine Stalin engineered in the 1930s. We've still got a few survivors. So that's that's very symbolic to, deny people food as a way of killing them. We're seeing similar techniques in the Russians now. It sounds like a small thing to remove power, to take out infrastructure. But as winter approaches, people can't cook, they can't communicate with their families. It's a very potent means of punishing the civilian population of Ukraine. We also have to remember that many people that we're seeing here have been multiply displaced. We had a woman in our group who'd been displaced from Crimea in 2014 with her family, settled in Mariupol, and of course there's nothing left of Mariupol, as the ambassador said. And she's had discussions with her husband, like, what is there to go back to? And, the trauma there of losing half of your friends and family, to just disappearing, seeing them die, knowing that there's nothing left of your home or your school or anywhere where you've had some history. And then having to be displaced from Mariupol to Western Ukraine, then into Europe, and then to Australia. This sounds like an easy thing, but each time there's this hyper-arousal, there's the whole thing of learning new systems. It's intensely exhausting. And so they find it hard to feel safe when they do come to a place like Australia, which is one of the safest countries in the world. And how long have we been providing safe harbour to migrants? It is hard to say to them, you are safe here. They're looking backwards, and a lot of them think, we can't put down roots here because we can't stay here. We have to go back and rebuild. Families are in conflict about what to do, and we know the longer migrants stay and the more their children get integrated, the harder it is for families to return. So there's going to be conflict between generations. There's going to be a lot of guilt about people who do decide to stay and don't return to support their families and help in the rebuilding. Our experience of helping new arrivals here, I mentioned that Stefan and I had this contact for people, how to navigate the health system, trying to facilitate admission to hospitals where people speak the language. But one of the things that we did, and it was largely inspired by the ambassador's wife, Tanya, from her experience, was to start up a women's circle, or žinoče kolo in Ukrainian. And it's a nice image, a circle of women. It started in Kiev, and it's something that now is going to be seeded back to Ukraine, because some of the participants in our group are liaising with psychologists in Ukraine, and they're going to do it online and reach into Ukraine and into Europe, where there are also displaced people. So along with my colleagues of different disciplines, I need to mention them by name because they're an amazing bunch of women. Kristina Kaldis is an art therapist. Dasha Brailko is a Ukrainian counsellor who came 8 years ago from eastern Ukraine. And Chris Kulik is like me, or she's a psychologist, but she's like me, born here of Ukrainian parents. We went out and invited women to come and join this group, and we had a pilot group which just finished last weekend with an amazing retreat in the Blue Mountains. We knew that in the first group we had to really learn from the women what they needed. We made a few adaptations to usual group therapy, and we combined a few Ukrainian, Australian and Indigenous elements in the welcome ceremony. We literally had this beautiful work of art that looked Indigenous but also a bit Ukrainian on the floor. We had elements from the bush of where Christina lived in the Blue Mountains, twigs and plants. We had a Ukrainian bread that's an ubiquitous signal of welcome, bread and salt, and a candle that would be lit each time by a different person but extinguished by all of us. And this group really grew, and we grew very much in the process. It's safe to say we were just blown away by the resilience of the women that we met. They were from all over Ukraine. They each brought different traumas. Some had, very few had partners here. As you may not know, but people who have more than 3 children, men are allowed to exit Ukraine, or if they have children with developmental needs. But most of them have partners left behind. These women just were such a support to each other in practical ways, but emotionally. They were so generous in sharing their experiences. It takes a lot for them to drop down the barriers. And we really felt we got to know what their needs were. And this is some of the things that they told us that are important. So just being listened to be given a space, in a safe space to talk about things in their own time. So firstly, within the group, there was an enormous sense of safety. But amongst health professionals, not being expected to just talk about their trauma, just on demand. Sometimes they just can't, because every time they do, they start to relive it. Just to understand that, if they're looking like they're coping, it doesn't mean they always are. They've got their defences up. We know from the studies of a psychiatrist called Jerome Frank, in 2004, he wrote a book. We know that the most important factor in counselling is not the type of therapy. It's actually the non-specific factors, and that is meeting with someone consistently, there's constancy, forming a trusting relationship, being heard. And this is something that we could provide in this group with economy of scale, seeing several women, and they amplified it by bringing their own support to each other. One thing they've often said is they're enormously grateful to Australia accepting them, but they find it hard when people ask them, what do you like about Australia? They've walked across the bridge and done the Opera House, because they're not here as a holiday from stress. They love the place. It's very different, both in terms of nature and the climate, but they're not here really as tourists. Some of them still respond to things like loud sounds, trigger reminders of air raids. And there's a story of a little boy who just freaked out in a beach in northern Sydney when the shark alarms went, because it reminded him of back home. Recognising that different cultures' expressions of distress can really vary. And it's safe to say that Eastern Europeans generally, Ukrainians do, find it easier to express distress in the bodily symptoms that I mentioned earlier. So sometimes that's an entree then to explore, well, what's going on for you when this is happening? And do you think it might be connected? One of the things that we wondered about was how much value there is in face-to-face versus online. And clearly face-to-face counselling is vastly superior. Face-to-face counselling in your own language is better than with an interpreter. But in terms of delivery, if you can't do it any other way, by Zoom is better than nothing. And that's why we're now branching out, and with the help of the organisation STARTS in Sydney that deals with torture and trauma survivors, we're starting an online group for women. We're going to continue to do face-to-face. We're starting up again, and we'll possibly branch out into different demographics, like dealing with teenagers or older women. So I think if, as professionals, feel free to refer to organisations like STARTS or whatever the equivalents are in other states. These are geared specifically to the needs of refugee groups, and so much so that having done a course earlier in the year in STARTS, a lot of their therapy is actually somatically based. They have physical therapists to deal with the results of trauma, as well as psychological support. So in the future, the help in Ukraine, there's going to be so much need for psychological support. And we as professionals from the diaspora need to understand that we can't just go and impose what we do in the West in Ukraine. We're really going to need to be, those of us who want to volunteer like I do, need to be guided by what Ukraine needs. And it may not be optimum, but doing something is better than nothing. And clearly there's going to be enormous need for psychological rehabilitation in people from the military, but also many injured civilians. And I'm not just talking about, physically injured, but psychologically injured. The general public has been invited by President Zelensky. I think I loved it when I heard him say, you can all help by coming and visiting Ukraine in the rebuilding. Come and help us when we are free. And to that end, I've just created this little travelogue of my favourite places in Ukraine to entice you. And I hope I don't go too fast and make you ill or trigger an epileptic fit. But I love this image that Ben got. It says a lot about Ukraine. The train system in Ukraine is fabulous. When you get to the border, they actually change the gauge so it's wider. It's incredibly comfortable. I've been to Ukraine about 5 times, and some of my best memories are on long-distance trains, lying there, being rocked to sleep on this wider gauge, and in the morning being greeted by tea from a samovar. And I think the Ukrainians here would agree that's one of the best remnants of the Soviet system, the samovar. Now, the map of Ukraine, no one knew where Ukraine was a year ago. Someone actually asked me a year ago, is the Yukon the same as Ukraine? This is my kids at Kyiv, the sparkling Kyiv airport. A few years ago we went on a Ukrainian school exchange, and this is one of the things Ukraine's known for, the largest plane in the world that the Russians bombed early in the war outside Kyiv. It will be rebuilt, I believe, hopefully. There's just some images of the beautiful city of Kyiv. This is affectionately known as the chick on a stick. It's not just by Australians, but Kyiv is the most amazing city. It's got wide boulevards. Compared to when I was there as an 18-year-old in the Soviet era, it's got an amazing vibe about it. You can get great food. It's just got an enormously interesting history and beautiful churches. I think everyone knows our president in Ukraine and the beautiful building in Kyiv, where he famously filled himself after the war to assure Ukrainians he was there. Churches are really big in Ukrainian culture, and this is the most famous church, St. Sophia in Kyiv. But wherever you go in Ukraine, wherever village you go to, you will find beautiful churches, from ornate ones to simple ones, little cupolas in cemeteries, and the most amazing Byzantine art, because Ukraine was christened from Greece in 988. The memories of the wars past are really still everywhere, and you all have seen the parade of the burnt-out Russian tanks in Kyiv. I think that will become a monument. This is my son in one of the planes that they have in a park outside Kyiv. This is a monument to the Holodomor, which is a huge part of Ukrainian history, and of course something awful that Ukraine is famous for is Chernobyl, and we're all watching what's happening in the Zaporizhzhia power plant very closely. I put in an image of some cranes. You see stalks, or these cranes all over Ukraine, this weird mess. Really is a metaphor, like there is so much ecological and environmental damage to be unpacked, not just from mines, but residual stuff from all the artillery. God help us if there's any nuclear spill to be dealt with. But this is a major challenge for Ukraine. The Cossack culture, the dancing is so vibrant, the culture, it goes back centuries. And this is on our Ukrainian school tour. That's my son in the middle at the age of 5, Cossack dancing. Taras Shevchenko, one of our most famous poets. It's interesting that the park that was bombed recently by the Russians was the Shevchenkivsky Park in the middle of Kyiv. But there's so many amazing writers and poets that Ukrainians have been allowed to celebrate since the end of the Soviet era. This was our Ukrainian school tour. We had a sister school in Drohovich in western Ukraine. Ukrainians love their traditions. This is one called Ivan Kopala, when women make garlands, float them down the river, and the guy who finds them is their betrothed. Quaint. Scouting, this is me with my scout group, sea of blue and yellow that everyone recognises. My favourite city in Ukraine is my father's home city of Lviv, once part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Just a gorgeous city. It's a mini Prague without all the Russian and American tourists. And it's now full of displaced people. Gorgeous cobbled streets, UNESCO heritage listed. This is another place that not many people know about called Kamenets-Podilsk, which is a fortress town in western Ukraine. It's just amazing. I'm sorry about the quality of that. Coming on a tiny road, they actually had to close it to buses because it was not strong enough. The Cossack era, this takes me to the place in a little island called Khortytsia in the Dnipro River, which is a recreation of a Cossack settlement. It's an amazing thing to do if you're in Ukraine, and they have recreations. There's an incredible Cossack cemetery here, as well as in Odessa. There's so much rich history. This is the Tunnel of Love in western Ukraine. Many of you know it, but It's an old railway track that they used to use for transporting plywood. They planted a lot of trees next to it, I think because it was used during wars for moving munitions to disguise the tracks. It is one of Ukraine's biggest tourist attractions. Ukrainians love to eat, break bread. This is on our Ukrainian school thing. They also like to home brew from any carbohydrate. I'm pleased to hear that the Ukrainian army is very disciplined and there's no drinking. I think this is one of the big differences with the Russian army. That's my mum and me on the right on this Ukrainian school tour. My son on the train that I'm saying is so comfortable. And I hope those images of, will replace these ones of, poor Ukrainian refugees fleeing the country. Two traumatic images, just to remember that there's so much rebuilding physically and psychologically. The world standing with Ukraine has been noticed by them. My own cousin in Kyiv constantly sends me images. Her favourite one was of the Opera House bedecked in blue and yellow. That's me with my son and his girlfriend. And they notice these things are important. Australians standing with Ukraine is really, really important. And this is just a little homage. This is my dad, my late father with my two sons, talking about transgenerational trauma. I just put my number there if anybody did want to call me, if you wanted guidance on where to get support for Ukrainians just in the future. And thank you so much for your interest in Ukrainians, in refugees. Just the fact that you're having this talk and inviting us here and you're interested is just, so uplifting, and we're very grateful.
Thank you, Tanya. That was such an enlightening talk. Thank you for highlighting how the socio-cultural complexities and the political landscape are really shaping the unique physical and psychological needs of Ukrainians, especially women and children. And it was very inspiring to hear about your A Circle for Women initiative. So great. And yeah, those pictures, wow, I cannot wait to visit Ukraine once we're on the other side. All right, so now it's time for our next segment, which is the panel discussion. And audience questions are welcome both from the auditorium as well as the people who have joined online. And my colleague Ben will be running around with a mic to whoever wants to ask the question, and also will be coordinating with the tech team for the people online. All right, we will try to get through as many questions as possible. However, we acknowledge that this is such a huge issue, very multifaceted, and one evening is not enough to really discuss all the aspects of it. It's such a huge magnitude. All right, so yeah, let's start.
Thanks, Ben, and thank you to all the speakers for a really inspiring evening so far. Vasyl, I wanted to just ask you a question. 4,000 refugees having come to Australia is a significant number, but relatively speaking, compared to the number of particularly internally displaced people, it's really a drop in the ocean. Do you think the Australian community and the Australian government, considering how fortunate we are with the financial and natural resources we have in this country, should be doing more to take in more refugees, or doing more to help financially and practically support people in their own communities, or at least closer to home within Europe itself and other countries closer by?
Look, as we're trying to get another mic, but look, it's a good question that you ask, and of course, as an ambassador, I would like to see Ukrainians safe back home, and those people who came here, and I pretty much met most of them. I traveled to all major cities, and I always meet those refugees who came from Ukraine. And there are many women with kids, and there are elderly people who came here to stay with their kids. All the elderly people who I met, they are all on their way back home, and I know many have already left. And if they have a house, where they can live, they all go back. They just can't stay here too long. They don't speak the language. They feel they are a burden for their kids, and they just don't, you know, all their life is in Ukraine. And in a way, it's just, and they are ready to go back to war. I mean, of course, if you were in Kharkiv or eastern Ukraine, which was invaded and bombed, I mean, you know, you have nowhere to go. But those who are in Kyiv or some relatively safe places, but again, there is no safe place in Ukraine, and you've seen all the missiles in Kyiv on Monday. But for the women with kids, I always, I'm there saying, look, that's a unique opportunity for your kids to go through school here. And at this young age, they can learn English really quick. And especially for all the teenagers who come here and stay for a year or two. And they will learn the language. And when you go back to Ukraine, these kids will have so many opportunities in Ukraine, which are not even, it will be difficult for them to get here. And let me just explain why. Because when I was in high school, I went to the US for 1 year. I was 15, and I spent there 1 year. And that year in the US has changed my life. And then I spent another year in London studying, and I could have stayed in London, but I never wanted to stay in London. So I always wanted to live in Ukraine. And in a way, the opportunities which I got because of that education that I got abroad in Ukraine are enormous for everybody who speaks English. Ukraine will be, rebuilt. And there'll be huge need for people to do it. And for every Ukrainian who can speak the foreign language, English, there are more opportunities in Ukraine than here. And not that you are not a country of opportunities, you are, but I'm just saying that for Ukraine it's a different perspective. Now, responding to a question on more refugees here, I mean, I'm not in a position to advise Australian government on immigration policy, which is a very sensitive topic. We have 2 Australians here in the panel, they can talk freely about it, right? And I'm a Ukrainian, so I can't really advise. We got Bruce Edwards as a representative of the government, and he's more than welcome to provide his comments on this. But it's very, if to put it very blunt and very simple, the previous government had a program which allowed Ukrainians to get financial aid, which they could use to rent a house or a flat before they could find a job. And once you find a job, you're phased out of that financial assistance. That program has expired at the end of July. And Stefan Romaniw is advocating very hard to have a similar program introduced for Ukrainian refugees who are coming. Because after that program expired, people just stopped coming. I mean, it's just, there are still some coming, but not at those numbers with before. Because if you don't have any financial cushion or you don't have some bit of money, you won't come to Australia all the way here, knowing that there is no support coming, you don't speak the language, and it's difficult, right? So just as simple as that. So there is assistance out there in Germany, there is assistance in France, there is assistance in other countries in Europe, and they of course, most of them are there because they can always go back. It's much easier to go back. So this is kind of course, I would like to see more Ukrainians coming and to get the benefits that previous batch has got, and because it just makes sense. And look, some people, according to the statistics I've seen, in crisis like this, 70% of refugees go back, 30% stay, right? And it's always like that. And I would reckon probably some people will stay here. But look, I don't think it's a problem, given that we only got 5,000 Ukrainians here, and everywhere I go, everybody complains to me there is a labor shortage. Labor shortage in farms, labor shortage in mining, hospitality is just crazy. I mean, last time I was in Perth 2 weeks ago, I had to wait 1 hour to get the luggage off the plane. And I asked, what's the problem? They said, oh, we don't have people to manage luggage. So you had to wait. The whole plane was full from Sydney, and they had only 1 team working, and we spent 1 hour waiting for that to be, said, we have no people. Get me the labor. All this, mining companies say, oh, we need truck drivers to work in our trucks. Farmers tell me, can you get me the drivers for harvesters from Ukraine? Because we have a different season. So technically we can have, our season has just ended in July and August, and your season is starting now for harvesters. We drive the same ones, John Deere's, right? and they know how to manage them. Of course, many of them are driving tanks, but look, technically, we could have brought in some people to help you temporarily to alleviate your pains, and then they could go back, including those in the mining industry, because we're also a big producer of iron ore, just as you are. So we have many of the qualified people there out, which stopped, quarries have stopped, because once you extract all this iron ore, and we actually have the same extraction type, which is like a big quarry open type. So we have people who understand how it works. And these people are unemployed now because we can't export the iron ore. So these people are unemployed. So even if they could come here for 6 months on a very kind of special visa, just working visa, they could make some money here and their families would benefit from that. For instance, I'm just giving you some of the examples. So how we can help you solve your problems, but also you would help us to solve other problems, because I would imagine for any miner from Kryvyi Rih, right, making like $40,000, $50,000 here in 6 months would be of huge help. They can rebuild the house, they can buy a flat, you know, whatever. I mean, send kids to the university. So there are so many different ways how it could be done, and of course, but look, I mean, it's a priority for Ukrainian community, and maybe you want to say something. Yeah.
Look, the first batch basically was to get people out of danger. So that was that. So that happened up until July 31. The second batch, anybody who comes now, still can go through a process. It's just a longer process. We've worked with, for example, Refugee Legal and other agencies that are working with people because they need to go either a protection visa or a bridging visa and so on. The ambassador's comment about employment, that's the other issue we're now talking to government about, because we're saying, well, there are two issues. One issue is there's a bit of an anomaly. So I came before the 31st of July. I'm here for 3 years technically. My husband or father or somebody has arrived after 31st, gets permanent residency, for example, which is likely. So what happens to the other part that, and when both flavours of government said for us, priority is family reunion. The issue of employment, somebody told me the other day that over Christmas in the hospitality industry in Australia, there will be a shortage of 67,000 people. So a lot of the resorts and are saying, well, you know what, we might be able to have lunch, but we won't be able to serve dinner. We might be able to serve dinner, but not to have lunch, you know, which is crazy when you think about it. So our conversation with government now is we need to look at this situation. But what I think we do as a community, you know, we don't know it all. We have partnered with some very, very strong people, strong advocates for this area who have helped us from day one. For example, I'll use a Foundation House. You mentioned the equivalent in Sydney. They deal with this situation every day. So what I said to our people was, look, we need to go and get the advice. Don't think we know it all. And those agencies have been very, very helpful. So the master plan, Mr. Australian Ambassador, which you don't know about. The master plan is this, basically to get people who understand this area. Now, we've got a round table, and we'll go to Minister Giles and say, Minister Giles, we want to help you find the solution. We don't want to create the problem. Because you have to understand one thing in immigration, and you know, Ukrainian situation, Afghan situation, you name it. I mean, Australia is renowned for taking in people from different countries because of, you know, war and so on. But there are guidelines, there is legislation, there's all those things. So you can't sort of say, well, you know, we're going to jump the queue because we're Ukrainian. You know, we have to work within a system. And I think what we've got is we've got the advice, and we've got a minister who wants to listen. You know, Minister Hawke previously, this minister now also wants to listen. We want to have that conversation. And again, our focus is don't create the problem, find the solution. And I think there are some solutions that'll be what you're talking about, a win-win situation. Because there are certain specialities, and if you look at what migration, sort of the immigration situation at the moment, you see that the government has put out a whole new list of we need this, we need this, we need this, we need this. And we have to tap into that. So you don't have to be smarter than the system, you just got to work into the system. So that's what we're trying to do, and hopefully we'll get a result. But the biggest anomaly for us will be, and we can, both colours of government, we can say, you said to us, family reunion was a priority. That's what Australia is renowned for. So we're going to have that situation because we have people fighting who ultimately have a partner here, have their children here, and will want to come here. So hopefully, and we can put your name down on the petition as well. Thank you very much for your... We can get the ANU behind you, and Christine, we can certainly do that. Ben, you've done a great job, if you can just fix that, mate.
Great, thank you for that. Maybe we can take the next question from the online audience, if there's anything that's popped up on the chat or Q&A box. Nothing yet? All right. Online audience, if you're hearing me, please feel free to pop in your questions in the Q&A chat box and we'll get to them. Okay, opening the floor to the in-person audience. All right, up there.
Cheers, Ben. Thank you. I just have a question. So, it is of course wonderful that there's so much like commonality between the structure of our economy such that, you can have these win-win situations. But my question is really about everyone who doesn't fit into that category, everyone who's not a miner, everyone who's not a farmer, everyone who, still needs the support, still, comes from the flattened city of Mariupol or, any other Ukrainian city. And my question is, I guess, what is the approach for this group of people? Because obviously it's a harder sell to the Australian government, and I guess I'm just curious. And of course, these people need the same support.
Let's get another question as well, and then we'll just respond because maybe we will talk about this, but maybe we take three questions and then we'll respond like each one of us.
Hello, thank you speakers for such a terrific insight in the Ukrainian culture. I work for Companion House here in the ACT, the Refugee and Asylum Seeker Health Organisation specialising in immunisations. And my first introduction to Ukrainian was some of these Ukrainian mothers who have come across alone with their children going, oh my God, the government is making me immunise my children, what do I do? They don't speak the language, they have no concept. Seem to be fighting a lot of misinformation and propaganda regarding immunisations, including the COVID vaccine immunisation. Any insight at all in fighting against what the government require and the bureaucracy and the red tape that I have to fight, that you must have these children immunised within 6 months? And then fighting the mental health implications on these children who have been uprooted from Ukraine, these mothers who don't trust the medical system. And I'm this big scary nurse going, I'm going to jab your child with 4 different needles today. Any insight would be greatly appreciated.
I might just do the immigration question. What happened was the visa regime was this. You came in on a tourist visa, 600. You then transferred to a 446, which then went towards humanitarian. Once you got that, you got your 786, which then gave you Medicare, Centrelink, accommodation, support. People were amazed that, for example, they got accommodation, also a truck rolls up with a fridge and a washing machine and sets people up. English language, so they still get English language, 510 through English ESL and so on. So they get that. The problem now is those that have come after that, they will eventually get to some level of that. The irony is, what do you do in the meantime? You don't get support, you don't get money, you don't get access. So that's the thing we're now trying to understand, because government had budgeted for X, And really, I think what happened was it wasn't that they hadn't budgeted for Y, they just thought, oh, well, this will somehow, you'll go away. And I think what we have to do now is that group, and that group that is having, because we did a workshop, a whole day workshop on immigration law and all those things, right? To get one of those protection visas, or whatever you call them, it's 72 pages of questions. So we now have lawyers who are working on that. But what happens in the meantime? So I think it's a very relevant question. That's what we keep asking about. So what happens? And I know we're not the only ones. But once you get that protection visa or that bridging visa, I mean, we've got people here, refugees who've been sitting on those visas for 10 years, which means they get all the services. It's just jumping that hurdle, and that's where we have to help.
I think what you're coming up against is a really common problem. I think you're looking at the effects of sort of deep suspicion of what government tells you to do and being mandated to do anything. Often when we tell people, look, this is how you navigate the system, you make this appointment, you call up, and they say, but what do you really do? Because there's a lot of corruption still from, in the past that has to be weeded out. And people have their own pathways of information and getting care. I think there is a lot of suspicion about vaccinations and what they might mean, and probably not helped by Russian misinformation, I would suspect. So I've said to people, look, we are a very heavily vaccinated population. Like 80% of people do this, and look, all the doctors and nurses do it. And just try and work on them. And ultimately, you might need to say, well, if you need to get your child into school, you have to do this. And every child in school in Australia, when your child gets there, will have had this, and they're all fine. So I don't know that you can counter it with providing research. It's a huge cultural leap. It's something that might be discretionary in Ukraine. And the COVID rates, for instance, were massive. COVID ripped through Ukraine. Because there wasn't enough vaccination and not enough precautions with masking and all the things that we took for granted. And certainly now they have bigger fish to fry. So, it is a problem, and I empathise with you.
There was this kind of, in the Soviet Union, the immunization was compulsory, so there was no questions about it. And in the 90s, it kind of became more optional, and then, of course, a lot of disinformation out there about, some side effects from immunization, which happened. And then all of a sudden, when it became kind of optional, many parents have opted out from immunizing their kids from like basic diseases. So actually, several years ago, we had a big spike in measles. Funny enough, I ended up with measles myself, because what happened, I was immunized when I was a kid. Apparently, it was not a good vaccine that I had, because when I was a teenager, I had mumps, and later on I had measles, like 4 years ago. All this, so what is that? What's that other one that I need to? So it's because it's a triple immunity. Exactly, rubella. So I haven't had rubella yet, but I mean I'm getting there, right? So that's the whole point. And I had it when I was a kid. Apparently, it was not a good vaccine, right? Because it's still so. But anyways, I mean that's the problem. Or for instance, polio, right? What else there? Which is, but measles is kind of, we almost there was no measles in Soviet Union already. I mean, it was eradicated completely, and all of a sudden we see like this huge, surge in measles, right? And without even talking about COVID and vaccination against COVID, right? But also like this anti-vax movement is actually very interesting. The Russians have capitalized on disinformation based on this. And I'll just explain how it works and why they do it. You see, all those people who are demonstrating here in the Parliament House against vaccination, this is usually people who are anti-establishment, who believe the government, they don't trust the government. And it's very convenient for Russia or for China to actually amplify the voice of those people in social media. The reason for that is very simple, because once you have a huge following of those people who don't believe in vaccine, you don't trust the government, they don't trust anybody. They don't trust media, they don't trust the government. And these people are very prone to conspiracy theories. And this is a very conducive environment for spreading Russian propaganda and disinformation, because once you don't trust anybody, you don't trust the government, you don't trust the media, you don't trust medical system, you live in a matrix, right? And then all of a sudden there is somebody out there called Russia Today or Sputnik who tells you, well, you know what? You need to go against your government because your government controls you completely. And this is interesting how you can actually get it out of proportion, and you don't need much money for that. You can have, a troll factory outside of Moscow, and then you can hire voiceover in Australia for $30, and then it will be spread out as a video as if it has been, Australia produced. And you then spread out it like hell in TikTok and all other social media, right? And all of a sudden, there is a huge following in Australia, people who don't want to get vaccinated. How come? And this is just only one of the examples of how you can undermine a society and how you can undermine democracy using actually one of the themes, but there are many other different ways. I spent 8 years fighting Russian propaganda. I can talk a lot about this, but it's kind of, this is what's happening. But I think we're running out of time, yeah. Look, if we have one more, if we have another round of questions, let's just take them, and then I think we'll just call it a night, because it's getting 9 here, huh?
Yeah, perhaps we can have one or two more questions.
Yeah, do we have? Yeah, we'll grab, yeah.
I just want to thank all the speakers tonight. Learned a lot and a lot of insights. Some of us in the room here are just students at the ANU, and I was just wondering, what are some of the ways that sort of the public, like us, students who maybe not in a professional capacity, who can help basically and help the refugees from Ukraine and Australia?
Yeah.
Thank you, panelists. From all of your discussions, there was a pretty clear theme that cut across, and that was hope and resilience. And I just wanted to ask Your Excellency and Stefan, with hope and resilience, what do you feel it is about the Ukrainian people that allows them to demonstrate that and maintain that throughout? And Tanya, I wanted to ask, in your clinical experience, how do you maintain that hope and resilience in your refugee patients?
Thank you all very much for your time this evening. My name is Matthew. I'm also a medical student at this place. I note it was mentioned by two speakers tonight that Russia has a very long history of incursions into Ukraine. In this panel's opinion, would a Ukrainian victory in this conflict be enough to prevent that? Or would the international community need to do more to prevent future incursions by Russians into Ukraine? Thank you.
I might just do the bit of the resilience and then we'll go across the... just give you a little example. I've used this a couple of times the last couple of days. I called somebody in Lviv the couple of hours after the shelling, and this friend of mine said, I said, well, I said, look, we saw the missiles, we heard the missiles, the house shook, the window shook, and, normally you'd say, well, geez, I better get out of here. And he said, my wife went out and started to wash the windows. And I'm thinking to myself, why on earth would she go and wash the windows? And she said, yesterday I planned to wash the windows. So no Russian rocket, no missile is going to mess up my day. Tongue in cheek, but I think that represents what Ukraine is. Ukraine and Ukrainians, you would have seen the woman with the sunflowers, and she dropped it and said, this thing's going to grow on you, and the guy's got the tractor, and the woman has put herself in front of. The way people have stood up is amazing. And to go, I think the ambassador will probably go into your question, but enough's enough. If you lose it now, you're going to lose it for a long, long time. And the people who today are fighting, and I think we're very, very fortunate, when you look at Ukraine armed forces, how sophisticated they really are. You know why? Because when Yanukovych came, he just about decimated it, and then all of a sudden you've got this new army that's come out, and it's NATO aligned, and it's not aligned in terms of thing, but the way it works. But I think the resilience is very important. And your question about how you can help, look, there are so many things that happen, and every day you get up and you say, my God, there's going to be a new issue. So today we're talking about the medical, and I think Tanya is best to speak about that. But just talking with people, you would have seen that what I tried to show with the governor was basically the women just walking and talking on their own, being able to connect, being able to have that opportunity to just be free for that little bit of time. So even taking somebody for a walk in the park is something that people like. But we have a range of projects. I mean, we have, we talk about Ukraine crisis appeal. We collect funds. We advocate on government. And I think one of the things that this group that we would call on you is you live in an electorate. You have an MP. You can contact an MP to say, you know what, I was at the ANU yesterday, I understand the Australian government is now, the Ukrainian government and the Australian government talking about cranking up military aid and so on. Dear elected member, could you raise this with the Minister for Foreign Affairs? Could you raise this with the Prime Minister? Could you raise this with the Minister for Defence? Because that's where the power is. It's one thing the Australians said, right, the day doesn't go by, we don't want to let it somewhere, depending on to the opposition. But, first thing, like the ambassador said, he's a Ukrainian citizen, we're Australian citizens. So every one of you have an elected member that you can write to tomorrow, and if you don't know who your elected member is, go to www.aph.gov.au, it'll tell you who your member is, and ask that question. And you would help us immensely if you raise military, if you raise the issue of immigration and visas, and if you raise the issue of expulsion of the Russian ambassador. If you did those three things for us, you'd do a great job. So tomorrow morning, we're going to ring you all. We get a list. Ben, you're it all, right?
Yeah, there'll be a Facebook post, guys, yeah.
Very early on, people offering music lessons, English tuition, dog walking, I don't know, just anything that they could offer that they thought would be of help. At Lidcombe, every Saturday we had a meet and greet. It's continuing, where we had all these, first it was donation of clothes and food and household goods. There was a group of Vietnamese bakers would just turn up every Saturday morning with a whole lot of freshly baked goods and just offload them silently, just because they found out that's where the Ukrainian refugees were coming. So the kindness of strangers is just amazing. But like you say, people often don't know where to channel it. I just suggest you go on to the Ukrainian community organisations, like we've got a Ukrainian community in Sydney, in Melbourne, we've got one in Canberra. Just Google it and see what's available, and if you've got a specific service, offer it. Ukrainians who have arrived here have commented just how generous they found Australians. It's just Australians in the street, but any Australians, as soon as they hear the Ukrainian refugees, they're offering their support, they're offering their empathy, and that really goes a long way.
And the question on the victory of the look like, you see, as 90% of people are really going to win war. And now, we can't, of course, we'll have to negotiate with Russia eventually, but Zelensky was very clear in what he said. We'll negotiate not with Putin, but who said we're going to be after Putin. And we believe that we need to liberate the entire Ukraine, bring Ukraine again, restore Ukraine's sovereignty, and then come to some sort of arrangement with Russia. enough nukes. Pakistan and India spent years to develop their nuclear programs, right? By using their students who were in America, nuclear physicists who developed their nuclear programs, right? And we, in 1994, give it up the largest stockpile. Would Russia ever invade if we had nuclear weapons? No. I'm not talking we're going to renew that, but now, all those countries who provided those assurances, who people say are not even worth the paper they're reading on, to guarantee our sovereignty and integrity. So how can we get that guarantee that Russia will not invade us again? Well, that's the way. Join NATO, build a strong military and a strong economy, and deter Russia forever from invasion. Because it's just there's no other way out. And joining NATO is a political decision. It's up to 30 countries to decide. Finland and Sweden, which have been neutral for such a long time, are now joining NATO. It's just a matter of time when they're going to do it. I think there are several more countries left which have to ratify the accession agreements, and that's it. And they got a border 30 kilometers from St. Petersburg. I mean, this is what the only reason Putin never wanted us to be part of NATO for one simple reason: we wouldn't be able to invade us if we were part of NATO. And in 2008, Ukraine was about to get the membership action plan, but France and Germany have blocked that. And then Russia invaded Georgia, Russia invaded Ukraine. The response to those invasions was weak. Sanctions which were imposed were weak. And this is what emboldened Putin to mount another invasion, another attack, and make Ukraine. That's it, as simple as that. And now we are facing what we are facing because the world has emboldened the dictator who changed borders by force because he thought the West is weak, democracy is weak. And he's going to be out there changing history and rewriting books and demonstrating that actually authoritarian economy can operate much better than a democracy. Because look, Putin has been running the country for 22 years. He's already seen many different American presidents, German chancellors, French presidents, and he just he has a big love of looking at those people. Oh, guys, I mean, I'm here for another 10 years at least. And who are you? Right? You're going to be gone, and I can actually take you down with, yellow gilets. I can take you down with the refugees. The Syrian refugees have provided a huge rise to far-right parties in Europe. Alternative for Germany got 14% of votes in the German parliament, and including all the other parliaments in Austria, in Hungary, far-right parties made it to the parliament. Do you know how many far-right parties we have in the Ukrainian parliament? 0. The most far-right party that ran for a parliament several years ago got less than 1%. But in Western Europe and in Europe overall, far-right parties are on the rise. Why? Because of the refugees from Syria. And why those refugees went there? Because actually Putin wanted them to leave Europe, to make Europe weak. And now the whole EU is weakened by 5 million Ukrainian refugees out there. And this is part of the strategy of Russia. So you see, we have to really stand up and step up support for Ukraine to actually make sure that democracy wins. Because it's going to be really difficult for everybody if we fail and we fall. And this will embolden many other authoritarian leaders in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America, and other places, in Africa, and everywhere, right? To change borders by force. Because once you see that you can do it, and you just can't do it, right? I mean, it's a dangerous path to be this time. Look, I'm very thankful for this opportunity to be here. I think it was a great evening. And so, please,
Yeah, I wish this could go longer, but it's time to wrap up in the interest of time, and trying to pass it over to this thing.
Thank you. I'm going to wrap up. Thank you for this fabulous panel.
by the Med Students Review. So over many years they've devoted that money. I want to thank the students for that gift that they've given us. And I want to thank everybody who's here today, for all of you for your fantastic insights. And I want to thank Mr. Edward Tanya, who has been a moving force behind this for some months now. And I tell you, the work that you have put into driving this has made me really proud to be a teacher in your medical school. Thank you very much. And Ben, as I said, he wants to thank some people, so I'm going to thank on Ben's behalf, Elena DeVore, Sarah Avenue, April Thompson, Skylar Alusha, from the ANU Medical Student Society, and Sarah Tooman, finally from the Psychology Student Society, Isabella Lorraine for her fantastic support through all of this, and Bart Karafi for her support through all of this in organising and promoting this initiative. I want to thank everybody here.